Hey, sparkly beans, and welcome to another episode of our Practical Astrology 101 series. We are coming towards the end of our fundamentals. I think we're going to have one more video and then a kind of wrap up where we'll put it all together looking at a chart. Wait, no, two more videos. Yes, two more videos and then we'll get to that wrap up. But today our topic is planetary motion. So we've been looking at what are the features of a natal chart, especially what are the features of charts in general. And a chart is, of course, a snapshot of the sky. So we are bringing in the concept of the fact that all the bodies in that snapshot were in fact moving at the time that the chart was taken. And so how does that actually play into our analysis? I'm going to try to go as basic as possible here because this was a topic when I started trying to outline it out. There were so many things I wanted to say that I think I'm actually going to do a few kind of deeper dive videos after we finish up this fundamental series. And it'll all be at the same playlist for Practical Astrology 101. So if you want to know more, particularly if you want to understand better, like how does the chart map to the observable sky, and how do you compare like actual orbits of planets with what we see on Earth, and then some of the like really cool patterns that you can see with planetary motion. Stay tuned, we're going to do that, but I wanted to just try to, as much as possible, zero in on the aspects of this that will be kind of most fundamental to understanding a chart. So this video is just kind of a little teaser of the idea that when you look at a chart, right, you're only seeing that snapshot, but that actually allows you to see not only where things in the sky, so kind of physically space, but also it allows you to locate yourself in time. So looking at a static chart, if you understand astrology, you can actually say to some extent what happened before and what happened after that chart without looking anywhere else. And I think this is just really cool, like philosophically, because it shows us how time and space are related, how they're one and the same, how we experience time, not just in the lived sense of like our bodies decay over time or circumstances around us change. And of course, as a change doula, I'm very interested in change, but also in terms of how is our physical reality influenced by the motion of our planet, especially relative to the sun and the moon. And then, depending on your views and your beliefs and how you feel about astrology, all the other planets as well. So just a disclaimer as we start, because I want to keep this at a reasonable length. This is going to be a strictly astrological, a geocentric point of view. So we're not going to yet try, that'll be in the deep dives, we're not going to try to compare to like exactly what's happening in the actual sky, the fact that we're actually orbiting the sun, nothing's orbiting us. So the language that I'm using is going to refer to charts using a tropical zodiac. So don't try too hard to translate and like understand how that goes with what you know about astronomy. I'm just going to leave that to the side for right now. Talk in the perspective of a tropical chart, and later on we'll do those deep dives. So there are two forms of motion in astrology, two main forms of motion. There's what we call primary motion and there's what we call secondary motion. So secondary motion is what we've mostly, essentially been talking about so far, in a way. And that is the way that planets are moving around the chart. So it has to do with the planet's orbits, but also their orbits relative to ours. And except in the case of the sun, where it really is just based on our orbit around it. And typically, secondary motion is going to go counterclockwise. So I believe the video switches, so for me, it's this, but I think for you, this is counterclockwise. Hopefully I got that right. It's always hard to do that in your brain, But yeah, counterclockwise around the chart. So if you see a planet in most cases at a point on a chart, then you know that tomorrow it's going to be a little further counterclockwise. And how much further depends on the planet. It's Pluto, it it's going to be completely imperceptible amount, right? As opposed to, say, the moon that moves very fast. And then we have primary motion. So secondary motion, typically counterclockwise, exception for retrogrades. We'll get to that. They would go the other way. But generally counterclockwise. Primary motion is going to go the other way. Primary motion is going to be clockwise. So that is the way that planets appear to move across the sky from the eastern horizon, which again is on the left of the chart, which is a little bit of a brain flip, I know, but the left of the chart, to the western horizon, which is on the right of the chart. And of course, this happens because the Earth rotates. So secondary motion is about orbits, primary motion is about our rotation, and it's the apparent motion across the sky. Now, so with secondary motion, I think one of the important things to kind of have a sense of is approximately how long different planets' orbits are, approximately how fast they move, because that gives you a sense, right, in the example I just gave, of is this planet going to move perceptibly at all in a day, a week, a month? What's the time scales we're working with? And this will also, I think, help you to cement some of what we already talked about with the planets, of their meanings and why their meanings might be grouped together the way they are. Now, in reality, the planetary speed actually varies. And so when you look at a chart, I'm going to give you like some sort of overall reference points, but as planets orbit, they speed up and slow down depending on how far they are from the sun. And so when you look at the chart, except for the sun and the moon, which move at a regular rotation around the chart, and predictable, and they never retrograde. So that's one thing to know, is that they move counterclockwise. That's always how they're going to be moving. And they're not going to, speed up, slow down. Everything else, though, does speed up and slow down. And so depending on the planet, you're not always going to know, like, how long it's spending in a particular sign, because that's going to kind of change depending on where it is in its orbit. And that's why you want to consult an astro.com maybe, or an Ephemeris to know that. But even though that's true, you can get a rough idea. You can see exactly where the planet is going or coming from by looking at what's called an Ephemeris. So that is a table that you can Google, like Ephemeris for 2022, and it's a table of where, like a calendar, like each day it'll tell you, and usually it's keyed to like noon local, or is it midnight local? It's either noon or midnight, I can never remember, but anyway, it'll say at the top what it's keyed to. So at a particular time every day, it'll tell you where the planet would be. And it'll have like all the planets across the top typically, and then all the dates down in a grid. So you can just quickly look and say, okay, 3 days after my birth, this planet had moved to this place, or 3 days before my birth, this planet was at this place. And you can get really interesting information about that. We're not going to go into depth about like the kinds of things you might do, but there are things called like progressions, secondary progressions being the most common. Whole techniques that are really like calculated to help you understand your life course based on where planets were just after you were born. You can also, even without an Ephemeris, if you have software that allows you to like easily kind of go forward and back, you could just page back a few days and see where things were. Page forward a few days. But so yeah, I'm going to describe for you kind of how long for most of the planets, I'll tell you how long the overall orbit is, like how long does it take to get around the entire chart. And just keep in mind that it's not perfectly evenly divided between signs. Some signs are going to be longer and shorter, so you would want to look that up for specific details. But generally speaking, so the moon is going to be the fastest. The moon has roughly a 27-day orbit. So it's going to go in one day, it's going to go about 13 degrees. So you can look at a chart and say, if I see the moon is here, I know that tomorrow at the same time it'll be about 13 degrees away. Then we have Mercury and Venus. Mercury and Venus both stay kind of close to the sun. They speed up and slow down, like I said, but their general orbit, even though their actual orbit is different, and we'll get to that in the deep dives, but what we see is going to make it look like Mercury and Venus are always real close to the sun. So in a chart, you're never actually going to see Mercury more than 28 degrees ahead or behind the sun, and you're never going to see Venus more than 48 degrees ahead or behind the sun. So I used to, when I first started out, right, I would look at a chart and be like, oh, Mercury is close to the sun. What is that meaningful? And the answer is no, not really. It's always going to be fairly close. Now, again, in a later video, we'll get into some of the interesting concepts, depending on how close Mercury is to the sun or how close Venus is. But in general, you're always going to expect Mercury is either in the same sign or one sign apart, Venus either in the same sign or two signs apart on either side of the sun. So you can't have, like, say, a Sun-Venus opposition. It's not possible. Then Mars has a roughly 2-year orbit. So Mars is going to take 2 years to go all the way around. So it might be with those other few personal planets, or it might be on the total opposite side of the chart. And then we get to Jupiter. So Jupiter's orbit is just shy of 12 years. So you spend about a year per sign, which is kind of handy. It's like, it's not obviously lined up to the calendar year exactly, but you have the sense of like, here's a theme, Jupiter theme for the year. And then Saturn has an orbit of 29.5 months, which is interesting because it's actually, so this is like the first kind of cool little pattern you can discover. Besides, I guess, knowing that Mercury and Venus are close, like that's one thing you can discover. Then you can discover that actually Saturn, 29.5 is interesting because we mentioned the moon's orbit is 27, but, and we'll talk about this in a moon video, which is one of the two I mentioned that we're doing next within fundamentals, but the moon's phase cycle, so the cycle from like one new moon to the next, is also exactly 29.5 days. So it's a really interesting, and this is something that's been extensively written about, right, is you have the closest body, the moon, and the furthest traditional body, visible planet, Saturn, and there is this reflection with their length. So moon 29.5 days, Saturn 29.5 months. And there's this sense of like translating these larger cycles down through the moon, using the moon to work with the bigger cycles. So that's just like one cool fact to know. But yeah, Saturn's going to spend about 2.5 years per sign. And then the outer planets, those are going to be the same in a natal chart for a lot of people who are born in a range of years. We sometimes call those the generational planets. And you're not necessarily going to experience all of the signs of those outer planets in your lifetime because of how slow they move. So that does make them great candidates, right, for talking about like bigger themes and broader things happening in society. And there's a lot of that. But when it comes to the personal chart, you kind of have to think of them a little bit differently, as we talked about in the planets video. So just knowing that for example, Pluto is in Libra on its own doesn't tell you as much as if you look at the aspects, you look at the house, like now you're starting to get to personal things. But the duration of the orbit, so Uranus is, and here I'm going to start giving the orbits in about how long roughly they spin per sign, because they're really long overall. But Uranus is about 7 years per sign. Neptune is twice. It takes about 14 years to make it through an entire sign. And then Pluto is just wonky as hell, because Pluto has like a really flat elliptical orbit. It just has a very different orbit from the other planets. So Pluto's total orbit is 248 years, but it's not neatly divided at all. So the others we can kind of like estimate and say it's about 7, it's about 14, it speeds up and slows down. Pluto speeds up and slows down a lot. And so a more useful reference point is that the fastest it is at is when it's in Scorpio. It spends about 12 years in Scorpio. That's the shortest. And then on the other side, 31 years in Taurus. So yes, if you're Pluto and Scorpio like me, you are the rarest. No. I don't know if that's actually true because of like birth numbers and stuff, but yeah, we had the shortest period. So I think it's kind of weird. Like sometimes people actually talk about Pluto specifically as a generational planet. And I want to make a little digression here. I want to like kind of give you an idea of some of these like generations, because I think Neptune is would be like a better one to think of cohorts. But just because when you do Pluto, sorry, I'm referencing my notes a lot with this to get it right, but when you do Pluto, it really tends to split generations in terms of the years that kind of sociology, like demographers, use to describe, say, millennials, Gen X, Gen Z. And of course, those terms are made up, and people disagree on dates, and they're very much based on, things that are happening culturally, and what feels like a generation. But I always think it's funny when people are like, okay, let's go through the Pluto generations and how they match up. And I'm like, that doesn't align. I assume people do it because the nature of Pluto is what they want to explore. Totally makes sense. But anyway, because of that elliptical orbit with Pluto, everyone who's being born now, like most people, generally people who are alive now, are folks who were born on the shorter side of that. We no one has actually experienced working with Pluto in astrology when it's on the slower side of its orbit, because Pluto was discovered in Cancer and it kept getting faster as it goes around. It's going to be a while before it gets back around, but now it's in Capricorn. It's going to be a while before it gets to Taurus. But generally speaking, knowing this generational thing can help you when you're looking at a chart that isn't yours to quickly kind of identify the generation. So like if you see Pluto and Leo, that's actually often described as the boomers. It's actually the older half of the boomer generation, including it also includes some much older folks who were born like in the interwar period. So these folks will be in their late 60s to early 80s now. Pluto in Virgo is going to be the younger half of the boomers, and the older half of Gen X. So people who are in their 50s or early 60s now. I should say I'm recording this in 2022. So Libra, Pluto and Libra generation is the younger half of Gen X. It also includes the very few oldest years of millennials. I say I'm an elder millennial, but actually, according to Pluto, it's the year and a half before me. So these folks are mostly in their 40s currently, give or take a couple of years on either side. And then Scorpio is pretty solidly like a millennial. Pluto and Scorpio is the millennials, more or less, with a couple of years in Libra, but folks who are in their late 20s to late 30s currently. And then Pluto in Sagittarius is going to cover all of Gen Z, so people who are currently in their teens, their late 20s. Capricorn, I shouldn't say it's all of Gen Z, but it's only Gen Z. Capricorn, you're going to get the last few years of Gen Z plus what we're now calling Gen Alpha, so anybody who's 14 or younger currently. So those are the Pluto generations. Like I said, Neptune's a little more reliable of an indicator if you like the generation terms, although it's not perfect. So like Neptune in Aquarius does line up pretty well with Gen Z. But then Neptune in Capricorn, again, kind of like Pluto, it misses the older millennials, like the last couple of years of it. And then Sag is going to be mostly Gen X, but it's going to miss the older Gen X. And then boomers get split between Scorpio and Libra for Neptune. So you have to look it up, but if you see one of those planets kind of solidly in the middle, it can often be a cue of like, oh, this is somebody who's probably a millennial, for example. Anyway, so yeah, I like considering one thing I like doing is actually considering the outer planets together as themes that kind of show how different cohorts of people emerge over time. If you look at people who have Pluto and Scorpio, Neptune and Capricorn, and Uranus and Sagittarius, for example, like what does that combo look like? But also, you can really see kind of trends of humanity, trends of like eras, the big picture view. Richard Tarnas's work, if you've seen the book was Cosmos and Psyche. I can't remember the name of the documentary, but looking at specific aspects with the outer planets, you can kind of start to see, because not only are planets in a sign for a long time, but they also hold an aspect longer. For example, right now, as I'm recording this, we're in the second year of kind of Saturn and Uranus square stuff, and I believe that continues at least to some extent through the beginning of next year. So when you have these longer aspects or longer periods in a sign, sometimes you can see societally how that matches up. And so when you're looking at your birth chart, it kind of gives you a sense of like, oh, here's who I am in my context. It may not mean that much, like just on its own that I have Pluto and Scorpio, but like, what does it mean that I have this chart among Pluto and Scorpio people? And then so those are the kind of the transpersonal planets, the outer planets. That's why they have those significations, because they spend longer. And then Jupiter and Saturn, social planets, kind of make sense because they're spending, like I said, a year for Jupiter, about 2.5 for Saturn. So now you're looking at like who was in my class as I went through school, like who were the peers that were around me all the time, and then who were the peers that were probably in the older and slightly younger years. The folks that I spent a lot of time with and had to learn my formative sort of socializing skills are going to be people who have same or close Jupiter and Saturn. So that kind of makes sense with the social planets association label. And then the personal planets are just zipping along, and that's representing kind of what are the phases that you go through in a year, representing the horse points to the season when you're born. So if you look at a chart and you see where the sun is, if you know the dates, then you can quickly get a sense of when they were born in the year. And this is why an astrologer can kind of like look at a chart really quickly and just be like, oh, okay, well, you had to have been born in March sometime in the early 80s, just at a glance. Even if you don't have all of the planets memorized necessarily and where they were at various times, if you have a general sense of, say, Pluto generations plus knowing where the sun signs are, you could do that. And we can also look to particular transits that happen at roughly the same age for everyone to be able to quickly look and say, oh, I can guess you're about this old, even without looking at the birth info, because you just went through a nodal return or just went through a Saturn return or a Jupiter square or something. And so we'll get into those in the deeper dive, the phases, the kind of like returns, squares, oppositions of transiting planets to your own planets. Actually, we'll get to that, and it'll either be the next or two from now, but the video where we talk about transiting aspects. So generally with secondary motion, right, we're talking about counterclockwise, but as I mentioned, caveat to that, they do go retrograde. So when a planet goes retrograde, what happens is you'll see it, going around the chart. It's going to start to slow down. And then, so how quickly it's moving through the sign slows down as it approaches retrograde. And then when it gets to the point where it's going to turn around, it slows down to what it looks like it's standing still. It's an apparent sort of standstill. We call that the station. So if you ever hear like a planet is stationing retrograde or stationing direct, what that means is it's the period of time where it's still and it's about to go backwards or it's about to start moving forwards again. In the chart, because of course planets don't literally move backwards. So that station is often a really significant or like intense point, especially for those outer planets that spend a lot of time in retrograde, and their retrograde is actually pretty long. You might not notice like, oh, Pluto's in retrograde. Pluto's in retrograde almost half the year, but the point at which Pluto goes retrograde, where it stations and stops for a minute on a certain point, if you have planets at that point or an aspect to that point, whatever you have in your chart is often kind of emphasized, activated, tuned up whatever aspects are happening in the sky are kind of emphasized, activated, tuned up at that point where it stations and it changes directions. But yeah, each planet has a different amount of time in retrograde. So Pluto, I mentioned, is about half the year. So while it might mean something in your natal chart, like that you experience Plutonian energy as a retrograde, so I'm a Pluto retrograde, it's not rare. It's not like, oh my gosh, you have Pluto retrograde in your chart. It's like, yeah, so do half the people. So then the outer planets in general spend a fair amount of time in retrograde. It really, from Jupiter on out, the retrogrades are pretty common. And then Mars is actually the rarest retrograde. So a Mars retrograde is notable because it is the rarest, and also what tends to happen is it almost looks like it gets stuck in a particular part of the chart for a long time. So Mars is moving along, you might expect, because it's a 2-year, if we took out the planetary speed, you might expect that, okay, it takes 2 years to go around the chart, so it's going to be, what is that, roughly 2 months per, if I'm doing the math right, per sign. But because of the retrograde, there will be a period of time where it just seems like, oh my God, Mars is never going to leave. So we had this in 2020, the second half of 2020, roughly. It was a little later than half. But second portion, fall, winter 2020, there was a long period where Mars was in Aries because it was slowing down, it was slowing down, it was slowing down while it was in Aries, then it's going backwards through Aries, backwards, now it's going forwards again, and the whole time it's just in Aries. So that happens. That I believe that's going to be happening again soonish, end of this year. And then Venus, so Mars will stay there, or it'll kind of stay in 2 signs for a long period if it's closer to the cusp. Venus is every other year, and Mercury, the reason we talk so much about Mercury retrograde, well, one, I think because it's particularly disruptive to capitalist systems, to be honest, but it's also really common. It generally happens about 3 times a year, and it's a 3-week period. So it's a very accessible, Mercury's going retrograde, and it just keeps happening. So when we think about the meaning of the retrograde, or of just speed in general, you can kind of think about, like, how do you act, just in general in life, right? Like, how do you act differently if you have more energy, more speed, you're moving quickly versus you're slowing down, or even moving backwards? Like, how does that feel energetically? You can think of that with the planets, right? When a planet is moving really fast relative to its general orbit speed, when it's on the faster side of its orbit, then, it might be doing its thing, real, like, boom, boom, boom. And of course, other chart factors matter, but it tends to be a zippier version of itself. As it slows down, it may take a little longer for the natal promise to really unfold. So if you have a planet, and again, you can check this with an ephemeris to see, if you had a planet that's not retrograde, but it's about to be retrograde, or it was just retrograde, it's going to be moving pretty slowly. I have this, for example, with my Saturn, where it is direct Saturn. It's actually a really well-supported Saturn in other ways, but it's slow. And so that means I kind of tend to need to have patience when I'm, putting in the kind of hard work, the Saturn significations, those kinds of things. It's not that they don't happen, but they don't happen quickly. And so I have to be, like, slow and steady and not necessarily change course, but just keep moving. And then when you have a retrograde planet in your chart, there are a number of different significations that retrogrades can have. So sometimes these planets are going to be more reflective and internal, looking in, reflective, reviewing. So, you might be more in the area that planet represents, the kind of action that planet represents. You might tend to need a lot more time, need to get all the information, need to understand, need to, tend to look backwards. Sometimes the retrograde planet can even be kind of contrary to its nature a little bit, because it's really frustrating when you try to force a retrograde planet to do what the planet's signification in general is. And so a lot of what we come up against, actually, I think, with the meanings of these, and when, especially like when they're transiting in the sky, Mercury retrograde is really annoying. Can be really annoying because if we're in a culture that expects us to go, 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 and expects us to use technology, communications mediums, expects us to quickly make decisions, Mercury, when it's retrograde, is like, no, that's not what I'm doing right now. Like, I need to actually rest in this area. I need to reflect on my words. I need to be slower and carefuler. There you go. More careful with how I speak. If you try to force me, if you try to make a thing work, then I might stop you by making your technology break, by causing an argument, whatever it is. And I found that when you're working with retrogrades in your chart or in the sky at the moment, that you have to relax. You have to surrender into a retrograde. You have to allow it to be slow. You have to allow it to be reflective. It works well when you work with it. And that would be true for any planets. Like a similar example, I'll just say that, yeah. So yeah, in your natal chart, like I said, like it'd be frustrating to force that area, and then also you may just feel like less in touch with that planetary energy, or more like trying to hide it. So like a retrograde Pluto like me, like you might be less comfortable with like power and control, or authority, like some of these, maybe not authority is a little more Saturn, but yeah, power and control, you might sort of like suppress or have trouble working with those themes. But again, like a forced slowdown, a forced reflection, we all need periods where we're moving slower, where we're reflecting. And I would argue that retrograde, right, it's a part of natural cycles. It gets a bad reputation because it doesn't match a sort of standard, measured time and consistent energy expectation that our culture holds. So the fact that we have this calendar that is sort of arbitrary and not based that much on a lot of things in the sky, right? We expect everything to be evenly broken up. We expect progress to move at a steady rate. We expect that if you are producing widgets, you'll continue to produce that number of widgets. And we may not value, or actually like work schedule is another example, right? The standard work schedule being, yes, we work on these days from these times and we take these rest breaks, and it doesn't, unfortunately, especially in the US where sick leave isn't mandatory, right? It doesn't really respect that actually people have their periods of retrograde. People have periods of slowing down and need to integrate. So I think I really embrace retrogrades, and I find that like working with them, I don't have a lot in my own chart. I think Pluto's the only major planet that I have retrograde, but when they happen, I really embrace that. So given some Mercury examples, another one would be Venus. You sometimes hear like, oh my gosh, your ex is going to come back. And like, I don't know, they might. But there's also an element with Venus retrograde of the importance of reviewing your values, reviewing how you relate to people. So that's another thing, is that a retrograde is not always about the thing is coming back, like the ex is coming back, for example. It might be more about reflecting on your relationship to the thing and your changing relationship to the signification, whether it's relating with Venus and beauty and pleasure, or maybe it's communication and information processing with Mercury, right? Sometimes a Mercury retrograde might be a good time to like look at your systems, look at your, look at the way you've been communicating, what you have set up for you, what's working, what isn't working. That can be really, really good. With Mars, you might look at like your use of energy and how you're using energy, and what your cycles are there. Okay, so that's secondary motion. Primary should be a little shorter, but primary motion. So we've been talking about how planets go round and round the chart, and now we're going to talk about primary motion, which is, like I mentioned, the path across the sky from east to west of the planets. So, of course, we're familiar, right, with the sun rising and setting. You might be familiar, or think about the moon rising and setting. There's probably the most accessible examples. We see them move across the sky. Every other planet does that too. So whether or not you've noticed it, you're going to have that same progression, same direction across the sky as the sun and the moon. So when you look at the chart, I mentioned this before, but just to review, the AC to DC axis, that's what shows the horizon. So that represents the horizon at your time of birth if you're looking at your birth chart. It is worth noting that depending on the house system, if you're, let's say you're using whole sign, like I currently do, that it's not necessarily going to be like this. It might be like this. It might be like this. So with whole sign and other systems that do equal sizes of the little wedges of houses, the cusp of the first house is what you have like this, but your ascendant descendant is not necessarily going to be flat. So just that's something to keep in mind, because sometimes with your eyes it's like, oh, the top of the chart is actually over there. But if you're using a quadrant house system like Placidus, you actually will have AC and DC there. So that represents the horizon, and then the MCIC axis represents the highest point in the sky, and then the opposite, like on the other side of the globe, the thing you can't see. Incidentally, if you, like me, used to think that the highest point in the sky always happened at noon, it does not. So just note. Maybe that's obvious, but I always thought it was noon. It's not. It depends on the time of the year and such. But it's going to be in between sunrise and sunset. Like that's the... I don't know if it's always exactly, but that's what you're actually looking at. So peeping really quickly at a chart and seeing like literally where is the sun can tell you things like this person was born during the day, this person was born at night. You get a rough sense of how close to sunrise or sunset they were born. So if you look at my chart, you'll see that the sun is pretty close to the top, and so therefore I was born in the middle of the day. And of course, all of this is location specific as well. You can, if you're curious, well, I should say, we also, just so you know, we say rising and setting, just like common vocabulary. So on the left side, hopefully this is your left, you have planets rise from the left side of the chart, which is the east, and then they set over here on the right, which is the west. We also use the term culminating, which is the top, and anti-culminating, which is the bottom. So just terms to know. Now, this messed with my brain a little at first, but I don't think it's that complicated. I have an issue with spatial relationships that makes some of this hard. If you want to know what planets would have been visible in the sky the night you were born, the night before you were born, if you were born during the day, if you're born at night, of course, if you see the sun below the horizon, then that's what was in the sky when you were born. But if you're born during the day, and you're just curious, you could just take a look and rotate the chart to tell. Roughly. The moon moves a little fast, so the exact point of the moon would be, 12 hours later actually would move, but most things are going to be more or less similar. So you want to imagine, if you're doing that, you'd imagine the whole chart rotating. So another thing that might be just like in your brain, useful to note is that, and make sure I get this right, if you adjust for time zone, a planet is in the same spot in the sky everywhere, right? So like if the sun is at 12 Aquarius, the sun is at 12 Aquarius no matter where you are. But where it shows up relative to the horizon is going to depend on location. So, if you're in the southern hemisphere, for example, it's going to be flipped. If you're in, a different point, even in the same hemisphere, it's going to adjust. So that's why you have to have the location. If you're trying to get houses, you need the time and you need the location to know the approximate location at least. But yeah, so you can imagine if you want to kind of like be like, well, what was happening at night? What was happening the next day? You can imagine the whole chart rotating. So if you imagine the horizon fixed where it is, and then you take the chart and you turn it, essentially. So the planets in their signs are turning, and you, let's say you have the sun, like I do, pretty close to the top of the chart. So you turn it clockwise, and there goes the sun. The sun is setting, the sun is setting, the sun is setting. You move it around and around and around, and now you've got the planets that were in the sky at night. So it's not a mirror flip, but it's a rotate flip. That only works for like what was at night, because of course the sun, the planets are also doing secondary motion. So you can't really be like 3 days later, I'll turn it like that's not how that works. But it can help you understand kind of the rising signs and when the rising signs are. I'll also just note that primary motion moves about 4 clock minutes per degree. So you can just know that if you're watching the sun move across the sky, that it's going to be about a degree in the chart every 4 minutes of time, of clock time. And I will actually show some of this in the later like deep dive videos. I'll actually show, screen share this and show it to you on a chart. But so 4 minutes, that means that each sign takes about an hour to go through the sky. So any rising sign, or that's not what I meant. The sign takes an hour. No, that's not what I meant. 4 minutes per degree. So my brain is like, did I do that wrong? Because that's not how that works. Because it's definitely 2 hours per sign. So the day is 24 hours. We'll do this together. A day is 24 hours. Each sign takes 2 because it's 12 signs. 2 hours. Is the 4 degrees part right? 4 minutes per degree part right? Well, one sign takes 2 hours. That's 120 minutes. You can tell I'm not good at this, right? I was like, did I write this down right? I bet I did write it down right. Now I'm second guessing myself. But hey, maybe this will help submit it. Do it with me. So it's 2 hours. 2 hours is 120 minutes. There's 30 degrees. Yeah, that's right. 4 minutes. Yeah, it's 4 minutes per degree. Okay, I don't know why I got that seemed wrong, but it is correct. So yeah, it takes about 2 hours yeah, that's what I wrote down wrong. The sign does not take an hour. It takes 2 hours for the sign to, for the rising to move through the sign, essentially. The sign is what's actually moving. So a rising sign lasts about 2 hours. So if you were born right smack dab in the middle of a rising sign, then you know that anybody who's within a reasonable number of degrees from you, or I should say, everyone who's born at a time that is within an hour or so of you is also going to be the same rising sign. More or less. It's all math, right? It's not exactly, but I'm simplifying. So, primary motion is always the same. It's always at the same rate, but the part of the sky that's visible in the morning, in the evening, etc., is going to change. So, I've been giving the example of my own, where I have the sun in Pisces, which was towards the top of the sky. I had Cancer rising. Well, everyone who was born on the same day I was is going to have the sun at the same spot in Pisces. It's going to be the same degree of Pisces. But the rising sign is going to depend on the location and the time. And the rising sign isn't, because of the way the seasons work, if you are, I'm Cancer rising midday, somebody who's born midday at a different time of year is going to have a totally different rising sign. We'll get in more about like why that is and the details in a later video, but that's basically, you don't just know because of the time what rising sign it is. You need to know a lot of things. You need to know where, you need to know what time of year. So everyone who was born at the day I was, and even at the time I was, is not necessarily going to have the same rising sign. And if you look at someone who was born at the exact opposite latitude, but below the equator, I would expect them to be a Capricorn rising if they were born at that day and time, because it would all be flipped. And if they were born at the same time I was, but in a different longitude, so like a different time zone, and the same latitude, then they would have a pretty close chart to mine. Same local time, I should say, local time, right? So if I was born at X time and they were born at X time in their location, it should be pretty close. Although, obviously, time zones, like, it's not literally, like, one block, right? They were born sort of in the same, how far into the time zone was the same. But if they were born at the same moment, the actual same time, not clock time, then it would look different. So anyway, I hope that kind of helps with knowing like, oh, like what does this relate to? The time I was born, the place I was born, like all of it. It relates to all of it. So yeah, you can get a sense of just like where you were in the day and some other things with this. And then the last thing I'm going to bring up, and I'm going to try to do it fairly quickly. This is not a major, like this is not something a lot of people talk about, and I think it's fascinating, is declination. So declination does not show up on the chart. So you're not going to see it on your chart, but you can often pull it. You can pull a table, or you can pull something that will tell you the declination of your planets. And what that means, so we've got rising, setting, east to west. What that means is declination is north-south. So you may know that like at certain times of the year, right, the sun appears at a different spot, like lower or in the sky. The same is true with everything else. And so declination is telling you how far a planet is north or south of the ecliptic. And the ecliptic, like what's the ecliptic? The ecliptic is the point, the north-south point, where the eclipses are currently happening. So like this year, the eclipses are happening at this spot. It's an imaginary line, but it's the point where the sun and the moon, because the reason why we don't have an eclipse every month, right, is because even if they're opposite in the chart, it's like if one is a little this or a little that, they don't actually line up and make an eclipse. Eclipse happens when they're at the same point, roughly, from north to south. So whatever that point is, the ecliptic, you can imagine, is a line, and then each planet is north or south of that line. And the sun never goes north or south of a certain point. And so if you have a planet, and only some planets can do this, I'm pretty sure, but if you have a planet that is further north or further south of where the sun can go, not where it is, but where the sun could go relative to that ecliptic, that's called out of bounds. So the rest of declination, I haven't even looked into it. I don't really know anything about it, but out of bounds I think is interesting, because this can be kind of a wacky energy. So I have an out of bounds moon as an example. And what I like to imagine conceptually, I like to think of the ecliptic as being kind of like the center line on a track. So imagine like a running track, and imagine that the sun is running laps around this track, and the sun is kind of interested in, has control of, whatever you want to call it, the whole track. And so as the sun runs, it veers to the left, it veers over to the right, veers over to the left, veers over to the right, it's going north and south. So it can essentially control or have authority over the whole track. And I should say, so whatever the planets are also running around this track. Even if the sun hasn't yet reached you, like it isn't where you are, it will eventually. So if you're doing something shady on the track, basically, the idea is that at some point the sun's going to catch you. That's how I like to think of it. Because you are within its range, its bounds, the places where it can go. And then you can imagine that there's kind of an invisible border, maybe like an electric fence or something, on each side of the track that the sun cannot cross. There's something that the sun is like, oh no, kryptonite, and cannot cross. And so out of bounds planets are on the grass, whether it's like on the field or whatever in the middle, or they're on the grass on the outside. And the sun will never be able to get to where they are. So whatever they're doing over there, the sun can't get to you. And whether that's good or bad, who knows, right? That's going to be other factors in your chart. But you can imagine it that way. The sun may or may not be able to see you. So we would, like in Hellenistic astrology, we talk about like classical aspects. And if the sun is not making a classical aspect, is not squaring, opposing, conjunct, sextile, trine, the planet in question, then we think of it as the sun can't see it. It's invisible, basically. So, you can imagine that as like, if there's not a classical aspect, then like you're playing around the grass and the sun never notices you as it's going around and around. Or it might be that there is an aspect, the sun sees you, but you're still out of bounds, so the sun can't get over there. So I like to imagine, like, if you have a planet in hard aspect, let's say a square, that is out of bounds, you can almost imagine the sun, which can totally see that planet, right, just kind of rolling its eyes, like, all right, great, so you're running out past where I can't get you, so cute. And, you know, it depends on that. Maybe if it's Jupiter, it's less bothered. Maybe if it's another planet, it's more bothered. But that's the basic idea. So, in my case, here I'll give an example from my own, like, a supportive aspect. So I have an out of bounds moon that is an exact trine. So they're real friendly. It's a supportive aspect. So it very much can see, the sun can see my moon doing its thing. But it's a really supportive energy. So you might imagine the sun kind of being like, yep, we're on the same team. I understand, moon, friend, you got to do what you got to do. There's something you have to do over there in that grass that I cannot do. I cannot perform that function for you. It is out of my bounds. So have fun. I support you. Do your thing. And so my, like, wacky moon may be able to access experiences and do things in a way that is outside of the bounds of the sun. That's one way of thinking of it. This is very much my own thing, and you know, I'm sure some people will be like, that's not really what it is. There's other relationships that's not. But that's how I think of out of bounds as a concept. It's less, once you've grasped that, it's less about the sun really than it is just generally thinking of that planet as kind of a rebel, an outsider, a weird, wacky. And so you can see how some of these ideas might go together. You know, if your planet is both out of bounds and retrograde, like, what does that mean? So just to wrap us up, in terms of practical relevance for planetary motion in these fundamentals, so planetary speed might answer the question of, why do some things happen quicker for you than others? Why do you have to be patient in some cases where you feel like you don't in others? Again, you also, you know, there's more than just that. You could look at the sign qualities. Some signs have a faster or slower energy, but that's one application. Retrograde planets might point to where you tend to be reflective, you tend to go internal, or you may be kind of out of touch with the energy of that planet in that sign. You may naturally kind of struggle, and you want to be gentle with yourself with retrograde planets. You want to consider giving yourself time for review and reflection. And then, you know, thinking of secondary motion and the outer and inner planets, you can remember that the outer planets are kind of pointing to the big picture context of your birth. They give you an idea of, like, setting the stage. The social planets give you an idea of your relationship to your cohort and expectations from others. That's a big, like, Saturn word, I think. But sort of the limitations, the boundaries that were set socially. Not just, like, Saturn doesn't just refer to your cohort, but the fact that those, timing wise, are shared with your cohort relates to the interpersonal nature of Saturn and Jupiter. And then the personal planets that are going zip, 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 give you an idea of your personality, your eccentricities. You know, how are you different from others around you, or how are you the same? How do you behave from day to day? And then out of bounds can just show you where you do things differently. So those are some concepts. Feel free to leave questions below. If you've gotten something out of this content, I would really appreciate it. I have a Patreon link where you can optionally support. I mentioned in this, talking about Mercury retrograde, I am pretty anti-capitalist, so wherever possible, I try to provide free content like this that has value. And if you're not able, or your support needs to go elsewhere, that's awesome. I'm so happy you're here. Please stay. And if you did get something out of this, or feel that, you know, you want to support others getting something out of this kind of content, then you can contribute down below at the Patreon. You have very low, starting from $1 a month all the way up. And then if you just want to hear more from me, of course you can subscribe, but I also have a newsletter below, and that's my favorite place. You'll get updates from me around the web, including YouTube, as well as some little exclusive reflections and being the first to hear about new stuff that's going on with me. So I hope you'll check those out, and I hope you'll stay with us for the last few videos of this series.